really great to be able to discuss what I do. I did want to share a little bit of my background because I think it goes really nicely into growth mindset and why I think it's so important and why I work really hard to help athletes develop it. Like Stuart so graciously mentioned, I am a former Bishop's Gator. I actually played for 3 years. So I went to Champlain for 2 years in the CEGEP. It was really wonderful. And then I graduated and I was able to go to Bishop's to play for 3 additional years. And I started to notice something that, I mean, at first nobody really talked about it because I had no idea what sports psychology was, but I started to notice I had this really bad habit of beating myself up. Just like anytime I made any mistake, anytime I did anything that was not perfect, I had this really, really big moment where I would just be like, why would you do this? What are you doing? And it didn't just transfer over to skills. It really transferred over from in practice, I could do anything I needed to do. I felt comfortable taking risks. I felt like I could really perform and excel. Like I would do things again in practice, like pull up threes, and I would have no problems. And the coach was like, yeah, go ahead, like do whatever you need to do. But then I'd get on the court and I would just freeze. And I was really wondering what was happening at the time. And so my third year, my final year of playing, I actually took a sports psychology course and I realized that, oh, I have maladaptive perfectionism. Now, again, that could be something that's good or bad, depending on how you actually use it. So there's an adaptive form and there's a maladaptive form. And realistically, what we're trying to do when we're developing a growth mindset is we're trying to get you to be at least adaptive if you are a perfectionist, which I argue most high achievers are anyways. But what we're trying to get you to do is be adaptive as opposed to maladaptive. And so what happens is when you have maladaptive perfectionism, it kind of plays itself out in different ways depending on the situation. But for me, it was very much situational, where the pressure increased and therefore my expectations of myself increased to an unrealistic level. And then I was really unable to develop a healthy relationship with failure, which again, when you're playing a team sport, is really just, it's going to happen. It doesn't matter. Like even in an individual sport, I would argue it happens. But when you have 9 other people on the court, plus you have pressure from potentially other people wanting your spot on the bench to, you know what I mean, the fans and the referees and the coaches to sit, like there's just so many things that are beyond your control. And so it becomes even more important to really become comfortable with failure. And when you don't have a growth mindset, when you have a very fixed mindset, it becomes very uncomfortable sometimes to have a healthy relationship with failure. And so that's sort of my story and my segue into how I even came into mental performance consulting, because I thought this is brilliant. I wish I had these tools and these skills. And I know you guys have also touched on resiliency, which kind of overlaps with growth mindset today. But basically, what I do as a mental performance consultant is I provide athletes and sometimes non-athletes with what we call mental skills, but also with the ability to have psychological flexibility. Okay. And I don't know if in resiliency you've heard this, but one of my other mental performance consultants told it to me in a way that made so much sense. So I'm going to use it today. So are all of you guys familiar with golf? Yeah. Awesome. So he put it to me like this. Essentially, he said that to have psychological flexibilities is like having that golf bag. Okay. And each mental skill represents a club within the golf bag, right? But you don't use a driver all the time, right? A driver might only be good to get you part of the way, right? And again, I'm not a golfer, so I don't know all the terms for all the clubs, but just imagine having all of those different clubs that you need in order to be an effective performer, okay? And that is really what I do, is I provide you with the whole bag of tricks in order for you to be able to, no matter what situation, no matter what you encounter, be able to overcome them. And so that's what's really, really important about mental performance and why I think it's so important. I'm extremely passionate about this. Like I tell people all the time, I could talk for 3 hours nonstop. Like I feel being, okay, I'm trying to leave, and I'm like, but wait, one more thing, like listen to this. So I'm really passionate about what I do. And again, like, this is why I do what I do. So another really big thing that I always find really important to mention is that everybody thinks they have to come to me when there's some kind of crisis. Okay. So it's like, this person's having a breakdown or they're experiencing a performance slump. I don't want to deal with it. You take them. And it's kind of just like, okay. But I argue that what we do is a very preventative approach. Okay. So if you work with a mental performance consultant, I would advise you not to start when there's a problem. It's not that we can't start when there's a problem, but there's this really big stigma around seeking out any form of mental support, whether it be mental health related or not. And it's always in the idea that the notion that, yeah, something has to be wrong with me. Like, I have to be like performing terribly, or something has to be off in order for me to seek it out. And so why I really like the optimization of performance is because when you have a growth mindset, you are always optimizing yourself, if that makes sense. So I could be for instance, my personal position, I was a point guard, then a shooting guard. Like, I just kind of flip-flop between the two roles. And so it got to the point where dribbling was fine, and so we're taking threes, but then I wanted to be good at pull-up threes. And then I wanted to be more focused and have a pre-performance routine when I hit the free throw line, because I wanted to increase my free throw percentage, right? And so there's no level, like, there's no ceiling. And that's why I think it's really important to talk about optimization, because I think a lot of people go, oh yeah, okay, well, there's nothing wrong with me, so I don't really need to talk to you, which I would argue that's fine. But every elite athlete at some point, whether they admit it or not, has sought out the services of an MPC, or at least higher level, like, clinical psych. So if you look at things on kind of like a scale, we're not necessarily therapists or counselors. We don't treat or diagnose any mental health concerns that people may have, but we look out for them. And we understand that things happen not just on the court, but off the court. So there's a lot of issues that are stemming, like, to give you an example, a lack of focus, right? Let's say you're really not focused, or let's say you don't have a growth mindset even. Let's use that example, because that's what we're talking about today. There could be things that are impacting you off the court. Like, let's say, for instance, I don't know, you have a family member who's really negative, and they're kind of like become your inner critic. Okay. And one of the books that I read on self-compassion kind of talks about how sometimes your inner voice can be either your parents or people who are really close to you. And so let's say, for instance, someone is increasingly negative and you're constantly in their environment, that can actually play a role in how you then speak to yourself. Okay. So that might impact you in that you feel like you aren't capable or handling things, or there's things outside of your control happening off the court. And therefore, when you get on the court, you can't be focused. You're not kind of honed in on optimizing your performance that day or getting 1% better. Like, you're not focused on those things because you're so worried about what's going on and what was said to you and how it was said to you, that you're kind of embodying it or taking it on. And it's impacting your ability to be 100% focused or there in the moment. So basically, I work with athletes individually, mostly online because of COVID. And then I do workshops as well. So again, if you wanted a workshop on focus, then that was what we talk about, or growth mindset. It would be more activity based. I like a lot of interactive things, but that's kind of how I work with athletes. And I've worked with different sports. I don't just work with basketball. I'm currently a coach and MPC at Ontario Tech, which is why it was Michelle, right? That's at Queens? Yeah. So I probably would have seen you once or twice. I am the MPC there, and I do a lot of work individually and mostly with doing workshops and a lot of team building and team culture early on in the season. That is the cornerstone of what I do. Like, if you are not aware of how you interact or what your triggers are or what is going to optimize, like, I don't want to say optimize, but like how you perform at your best, what do you do that helps you perform at your best? How do you want to feel? Like, there's so many things that are encompass that. So self-awareness is really the starting point of what I do. And that involves a lot of, what are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? A little insider of what I do with some of the Ridgebacks is just that I actually then get the coach to do the same assessment of the players to see where there's discrepancies, and then talk about those discrepancies if there are some, why they're there, what they mean. I try not to deter the athletes from, because I think there are often two viewpoints, especially when you're playing a team sport at a high level on a university and even at a younger level. But there's more in-depth conversations that happen, at least at university. So it would be kind of assessing what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are, what their goals are, and then going from there, because I think that that's really important. Working in depth with the Ridgebacks is not just goal setting, it's the revisitation of those goals. It's the continued conversations of how are we progressing? What are we doing? Are we continuously working towards it? Or do we need to make some adjustments to those goals, right? And so everybody wants to get better, but I think that's really the starting point for me in terms of like, okay, well, what are you trying to do right now? If it's, I feel really unfocused. Like I feel like I'm not always there for all 4 quarters, or it takes me a half to really get into it. Or I'm not good at taking risks because I'm scared I'm going to get subbed off the court if I do, right? Or I really want to be, a really good example of a client I worked with, I really want to be a combo post where I start, kind of like slowly bringing myself out to the wing and then being able to attack from the inside, because there's been a certain level of mastery, right? Around the key, around the rim, the finishes are good, right? They're able to do counters. So, it's just expanding their game and being able to take it to the next level, to help them take it to the next level, and whatever that means, and being realistic about it. Because I think if you're in university, and you don't like play that much, but you want to go to the NBA, you know what I mean? It's kind of like, okay, well, we got to talk about this. But I never want to deter anybody, basically, but I want to make sure that their goals are realistic and that they're not just doing things every like once a year. Because I know me personally, I'll set a goal and I'll never revisit it again. It's like, yeah, I want to eat healthy, and then it's like, okay. And then 3 months go by and yeah, I want to eat healthy, and it's like, okay, you said that already, right? So it's really making sure that you're on track and that you're doing things daily to get better, not even weekly. Like I want to know what you're doing every single day, and how you kind of live through your values to be able to really be the kind of player or person that you want to be, whether it's on or off the court. I have to say, being very transparent, being a coach and an NPC is a little bit challenging on my team. In our field, it is not recommended. At Canada Basketball, because my coach works with Canada Basketball, they're like, this is gold. Like she does both. Like this is amazing, right? But I think the barriers are the stigma behind coming to see me, and then the inability to separate the two roles, for me, at least from Ontario Tech purposes, because I think I am a coach, so I have to discuss with the coaches, but I'm also, in my field, there is a level of confidentiality. You sign the form, none of that information goes to the coach. So for me, I find the struggle in the balance between the two. And then the coach wants to know because they've clearly seen me talking to this player, so they want to know what's going on, but it's like I actually can't tell you. So I find sometimes the struggle with a lot of athletes is like, one, either I don't want to admit that there's reasons, because again, people only see me when there's an issue. And most people don't want to admit that there are issues, and it doesn't have to be anything huge. It could literally be like, I'm so unfocused, I'm feeling so unmotivated by this. Like when you play basketball for a long time, your passion doesn't always stay 100%. Like some days you don't want to go to practice, and that's really normal, right? But it more matters what you do. And so even if it's something as simple as like, I feel like I've lost my love for the game, like we can talk about that, right? It doesn't have to be anything like, okay, I'm a star player, I can't handle pressure, and like I'm really stressed out and I'm not performing well at all. Like there's a huge slump, Naomi. Like I don't know what I'm gonna do. Like fix me, right? So that's a lot of what I find is an issue. And again, for me, the dual role, like my clients who are not attached to the university, I have no problem with. They're fine. But I think one, the buy-in, right? It's new. Nobody really knows what we do a lot. And then again, the stigma. And then with my own athletes, the dual role.
Yeah.
no matter what kind of player you are, no matter whether you start or you play 3 minutes, some of the commonalities that I see are, again, this inability sometimes to develop a growth mindset. It's not always that way, but more specifically, taking risks. Like, players will not, especially if you're like a rookie and you're just trying to get used to the system of how things work, and then even you're trying to build up to the point where you're trying to play, you are not trying to leave the confines of what your coach has deemed or the role that you've been assigned, because you're scared if you go out of that, then that means less playing time for you, or that means somebody else gets to take your position, right? Pressure. A lot of athletes are not necessarily the best at dealing with pressure, and not necessarily that they never have good performances, but how do you perform consistently, especially when the stakes are higher? I find a lot of athletes struggle with that as well. Those are two big ones. And interestingly enough, I find athletes as a whole struggle with self-awareness. And I am guilty. Like, I didn't figure out to my third year that this was something that I was even dealing with, right? Like, I was kind of like, okay, but nobody really talks about it. You're not allowed to tell the coach, because then the coach is going to take away, your position. Like, I was starting, so I didn't want to lose my starting spot, you know what I mean? Because I'm telling him, well, like, I'm struggling right now. I'm really beating myself up, because it's like, yeah, you should be. I've had coaches blatantly tell me, like, I feel like you can handle it, and then be like, what is that? Like, if you're gonna do that, like, go play house league. You know what I mean? It was just like a huge, like, okay, well, yeah, whatever. I'm just gonna do what I need to do. And lastly, I find performance anxiety. Okay, that's not to say you have generalized anxiety. That's to say that when it comes to performing, and like I said, there's 10 players on the court and you're only one of them. There's so many things you can't control that can stress you out and that can really take you out of your performance, either before you even start. Like, I've had games where I've completely psyched myself out before I even got on the court, and then I couldn't perform, right? Or again, like, you get to the fourth quarter, then you're all of a sudden your performance changes, right? Because this quarter all of a sudden is way more important than the 3 previous quarters, because it's closer to the end and you have less time. So to kind of like change your performance, even though to perform for 3 quarters means that whatever you're doing well, if you're performing well, is working. I find that those are some things, or that are consistent across players. There's a really important thing that happens when you do an assessment with an NPC. Part of that is taking into consideration what clubs you already have in your tool belt, because you already have some. Like, some people naturally have some of these skills, right? So it's identifying what skills you currently have, creating like a player profile, and that takes into account like your personality and some of the skills you already have, and then being able to practice the ones that you feel are really necessary for you to perform well, right? Because I'm personally, as an athlete, I can only speak for myself, but I needed to be like at a certain arousal level. When we talk arousal regulation is a potential skill we can talk about. And for me, if I was not at the right arousal level when I started, I was no good. I was either too high or too low, and then I felt like I was slow, I was cold, everything felt like so much faster, or I was completely overthinking where my brain was going, and like I was like basically squirrely on the court, right? And so there's a certain level for me that I had to be focusing on the things that I can control the controllables. I'm a worrier, right? I mean, sometimes that's not great as a point guard, but as the person on the floor who's trying to control it, like control the momentum and basically kind of be like the coach's right hand, you're trying to figure out what plays should we be running, who's scoring most often. Like, you kind of have to think about all of these factors. At least for me, that's what I found. So stress management became very, very important for me, right? To kind of like learn, okay, this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm controlling. As a point guard, yes, you control a little bit more, you have a little bit more responsibility, but it's all about kind of doing that assessment, figuring out what tools you need, what tools you already have, and then which ones are going to be the difference makers for you, because not everybody will use imagery, or not everybody needs stress management techniques, right? Some people need breathing techniques. Some people need to learn more like mindfulness-based techniques when they are having self-doubt on the court, and they really just need to put it to rest, because that's really not going to help them, perform at the moment, right? So it does vary, but that's why we do an assessment and we kind of see where the areas of improvement are, regardless of whether you feel like it's in dire need or it's just sort of in need. One of my favorite quotes is, "You don't rise to the occasion, you sink to the level of your training." And so basically what that means is if you're not put in situations that could occur, you're not going to be prepared, right? And so part of what we do when we're talking about preparation is like obstacle planning or, just kind of situational planning and figuring out like as an athlete, as an individual, how do I prepare for these moments? And then as a team, how do we prepare for these moments? Something like as big as a championship, people really blow it up. But I actually argue that that's one of the traps that we fall into as coaches. It's like, okay, like we've never been here, chance of a lifetime opportunity. Because if you need your team to perform consistently, and if you know what they've performed like at their best, changing that and making it a bigger thing than it is doesn't always warrant like a good response, right? Like now you're increasing the pressure that they feel because what more can you give than 100%? You know what I mean? Like I know we say 110%, like that's something that I've even said it. I'm just like, I should probably stop saying that. I'm an NPC, but like you can't give if you're asking someone to give more than their best, then you're asking them to change what's been working for them consistently. Asking them to give 110% in like a championship game, not always ideal. It depends on the personality. As coaches, like I coach, there are some athletes you could be like, if you don't hit this next shot, like it's me and you, and I say it very jokingly, but like they'll be like, yeah, okay, coach, I got you. And then some people are like, oh my God, this is it. Like I'm gonna be on the bench since I'm the last, like then they're just like, I'm over it. It's very situational, but yes, I put them in those conditions over and over again until they get to the point where basically they're desensitized. Like if you experience pressure all the time at this, eventually you're gonna get like, okay, yeah, I'm used to this. Now it's gonna be here. And then you get used to it and you're like, yeah, okay, now I'm used to it again. Now I'm here. Right. And eventually you get low where it's just like you're used to these experiences, right? But time management is the biggest issue any student athlete faces. I don't care if they're good at school or not. I don't know how many times I've had to go through somebody's calendar and been like, you need to make time to study. You have games on Fridays. Like you can't you can't study after the game. You're exhausted. Like if you think you're gonna go on a bus for 4 hours, it's gonna be pitch black. All your friends are gonna be on the bus. Sometimes the girls and the guys teams are together. So now everybody's chatting amongst the two teams. And you think you're gonna study? Forget it. Forget it. It's not happening. Sometimes the skills are different that they need, but I actually find they're actually more similar than you think. People who experience self-doubt on the court just don't experience self-doubt on the court. They experience self-doubt in other areas of their life, which means that the anxiety of performing might appear on tests too, right? But the opposite could also be true because taking a test is such a low pressure situation compared to playing a game, right? Where people are watching and there's all these things happening. So they can vary, but they can also be very similar. I find so far they've been pretty similar across, like on and off the court. Because again, if you're lacking focus in the classroom, the chances are you're probably lacking focus on the court as well. Like it takes a little while to get used to your players. So for me, I notice because I know my players. I know some coaches will be like looking at the warm up and be like, oh, that person's not ready to play. But that's not always true. It really comes down to knowing. For instance, like let's say we were to do work together and you were like, oh, my arousal level has to be like 7 before I start the game, right? Like you have to be a certain level. And then you're like jogging up the court and you're like sleeping in the change room or you're just kind of really sluggish, like that would be an indication to me that something's up. I wouldn't know what, but again, I can very easily tell, if not during warm up or on the bus, within the first quarter, I know. I had a point guard who, I mean, we played Ottawa U, which was like not fun at all. I mean, I don't know what happened that game, but our point guard was just, she looked like a deer in headlights. And this is our, like, she's our general, right? Like, she runs all our plays, but she's not a vocal type of leader. So it was in her actions that we were kind of like, okay, what's going on here, right? But for her, it was just like, every single one of our players is a first year. They've never played university basketball. Like, everybody was encountering this situation for the first time, and now we're going up against what at Ottawa U was like the number one team at the time. You know, for her it was like, oh my god, this is like an impossible moment. Again, maybe a sign that she wasn't necessarily ready for the challenge. And when we talk about growth mindset, we talk about reframing, right? That's one of the biggest things that I do when we talk about growth mindset is reframing. So instead of seeing it as a threat or being scared of it, some of our athletes were really ready to play Ottawa U. They were like, yeah, best team in the country. Like, let's really see what we can do. At the time that I was playing, it was Windsor. And we were, again, mostly first years, and we held our own, right? And it was exciting. Like, we got to play against, they had the top two players in the league at the time. And they had won, the Windsor girls had won like 3 championships consecutively. And we were just like, yeah, you know what? Screw it. We already like, we're like basically a brand new team. Like, we're just going to go for it. And yeah, it was fun. I liked it. But what was really important was that I saw it as a challenge, and I saw it as an opportunity to see what we could do. And so to answer your question, it kind of does depend. But if you know yourself, and this is the self-awareness piece, you'll be able to tell that, you know what, like, I need to like get myself like more motivated, or I just need to calm down, I need to breathe, or I'm psyching myself out, or, you know, I'm getting really stressed out about this particular situation. And having those strategies, like the bag of golf clubs is really important, so you can pull one out. If you know you need relaxation, you got to pull out, you know, one of the golf clubs. And then if you know you need imagery, or you know that you're thinking thoughts that are a little bit unhelpful to your performance, like, how do you either let them go, or how do you, you know, reframe them in order to see it as a challenge and to get you motivated again to perform. Honestly, this is one of my favorite workshops to do. It's not something that I could just be like, this is what you have to do, but essentially you kind of give yourself a scale from 0 to 10 or 1 to 10, depending on what you want to do. And no person's optimization level is the same. I say 7. I probably needed to be at like a 6 to 6.5, because I knew if I was at a 10, my brain was doing this. And I knew if I was at a 0, I was just like, I had extreme like feelings of self-doubt. I felt like I couldn't move my body. It's so crazy, the correlation between like the cognitive and the physiological responses. Like, a lot of people think they're very separate, which is why people say, yeah, basketball is a physical and not a mental sport. But no matter what you do, me moving my arm right now, my brain has to send a signal to my body, to my muscles, to move my arm. So I argue everything's actually mental. You're just so used to doing certain things that you don't even have to think about them. So scale and playing around with it. Like, I spend a couple practices where I say, try to imagine what your level is, and then see if you can get yourself there and maintain that for the most part of practice, right? And then you can start to gauge, okay, you know what, like, this time I felt out of focus, I was zoning out, I'm maybe too low. And this time I was overthinking everything, and I felt like my brain was going a mile a minute, I'm too high. And then you kind of develop this way. But there's so many different techniques you can use to either, if you're not high enough, get yourself there, or if you're too high, lower yourself. And I actually asked 3 of my players to do a debrief sheet, a post game debrief.
Yeah.
And it's a full reflection, and we have discussions about them. With the mental stuff, my coach is like, just force them, Naomi, they have to do it. And I'm just like, I don't really want to do that. But like, I also think there's so much value. Evidence supports that post-game reflections are actually so vital in helping people improve from mistakes and actually optimizing their performance. It's crazy. So I have like a sheet that I've created that my players fill out, and they have discussions with me post-game, and we have those talks about, okay, well, what went well, right? And part of the self-awareness is I get people to standardize their best and their worst performance. I get them to think about the both of them in various ways, and then we compare it. So they have a standard, and then they keep updating their standards of best and worst performances based on their concurrent experiences, basically. If I could, I just want to obviously speak more to the coaches than some of the players, but some of those things that I mentioned are very important. Some of the, you either have it or you don't, or you're not a shooter, so stop shooting. And it's not that you can't be transparent or honest with some of the players, but I think that there's a certain environment that allows the support and foster of a growth mindset. And that doesn't mean that you don't hold players accountable, and that doesn't mean that you don't call them out. It just means that on their way, their way, I guess, that player's way to supporting the player that they want to be or the person that they want to be, it's understanding how some of these things impact them, because reframing is very important. For instance, you're not a shooter, so stop shooting, right? I think a better way to reframe that is to say, hey, right now, I'm not comfortable with you taking threes. It's not to say that you never will, but right now, I need you to develop your inside game, or I need you to, master your mid-range and that stuff before we kind of pull you out to develop those things, right? Because I have a lot of, ironically enough, I work with a lot of posts who want to be guards, right? And it's not that it's impossible, but there's a lot more that has to go into it first. Like if you're not mastering the inside game, I can't pull you out yet, but it's yet. Right? You're not there yet. Like we need to keep working on this. This is a off-season project that we can work together on, and how can I support you through these things, right? And it's not to say there aren't instances where players are just being, I'm gonna say this, babies, where they're like, oh, this is so hard. Like I don't want to do this. Again, like I'm both a coach and an NPC, so I do know there are instances where players are just kind of like, they are kind of being lazy, but oftentimes I found in certain situations, there was really stuff going on that we just weren't aware of, and it was really impacting them that day. And so asking them, even if in practice it's hard, asking them like, hey, are you okay? Like, is something going on? It shows that you really care and that you support them, even if you are going to push them really, really hard, right? And one of the biggest things that I want to implement this year with my team is challenging the players. Like before you go into practice, like you can choose a player that you're going to challenge that day, but if you tell them like, hey, you know what, today I'm actually going to challenge you, or as a team today, I'm about to put you through like high pressure situations all practice, so be prepared. It's like you give them, okay, the space to anticipate, right? And when they can anticipate, they can expect failure, and therefore it becomes a normalized process, and that helps with growth. Like if everybody's gonna fail, yeah, we're all just gonna fail together, fine. But it's like if that single person is always failing all practice, and I'm sure we've all had this, like I feel like the target one practice, and my coaches openly told me like, I'm gonna push you, but it turned out to be this thing where it was like always just like you, and that's too much, right? So I think that there is a fine line, and it's really good to have a supportive environment. And again, as athletes, sometimes coaches are going to push you purposely outside of your comfort zone. But I think if we can increase that conversation, open up the lines of communication, and understand that these are moments of where a coach is actually trying to support you in helping you achieve your goals, or again, vice versa. As coaches, you acknowledge and you tell them like, this is how I'm supporting you. I think it is going to make the process a little bit easier for both sides.
Yeah.
I'm actually going to pick communication.
Ooh, curveball.
And I'll tell you why. Because communication is not just how you talk to others, but it's how you talk to yourself. And if you want to develop a growth mindset, you need good communication between like your thoughts and your body, and like everything needs to communicate, from literally you with yourself, to you with your other teammates, to you with the coaches, to the coaches, to the coaches, to the coaches, to the APs. That is my number one thing, because I think it allows for the rest to kind of happen. So that's why I actually chose communication.
Hmm. Oh, well answered. Well played.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, no, it has been a super privilege to have you on. You are just a wealth of information. You hit so many of the key things that I think as players you guys deal with, and then as coaches I
Mhm.
see all the time in the players that I'm coaching.
I really want to thank you guys for having me on. I'm really passionate about helping people succeed. So, in any way that I can help, like I'm ready. So, yeah,
Great.
I'm ready. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank
Awesome.
you very much.
It was really nice to meet you all. Thanks for having me.